It's setting up now.
All right.
All right. What I'll do is. Hold on. Hold on. Why is it doing that? There you go. Stand by, still setting up. Oh man. Hey Jeff, what's going on? Just setting up, stand by for a second. Let me figure out what we got going on. What the heck? All right, I got you, Connie. I think we're good. Let me just make sure we're live. It just took me a second to set up for a second. I want to make sure I didn't close anything off. And I got you, Connie.
All right.
Okay, yeah, let me just make sure we're good. Just testing it. I believe we're good. Just do a test, Connie. Say hi.
Hi.
Okay, good. We're still good. Okay, so hold on one second. Okay, so what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to share this out, and then we'll get started. So, and then we're good to go. I like to just share it on the Facebook pages.
Okay.
And then I'll read the questions as they come across. So hold on one second. So we are live, so people can see us now.
That's great.
Hey, it's a good format because it's good to get the interaction from the audience. I'm still learning kind of how to set it up. So I kind of still go through a little bit of a process each time, but I'm getting better.
It's all good.
Oh, it's fun. I think it's fun.
Yeah. You like this stuff.
I like this stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. Okay, good. So you guys can hear Connie. You guys can hear me. What's up, Jeff? How you doing? All right, hold on. Okay, good. All right, so as we get started, we got some people coming into the room now. So again, we're going live. It's Tier Talk. We do another question and answer, but today I want to focus on a couple of topics which will relate very well with my guest, Connie Alleyne. I want to talk about maybe custody dealing with medical staff. I maybe want to talk about medical assisted treatment, so inmates that are on, let's say, Suboxone, how we're dealing with that in the prison setting. And I also maybe want to touch on officers carrying Narcan, which seems to be a very touchy subject. But Connie, do you mind introducing yourself to my audience?
Sure. My name is Connie Alleyne. I'm the founder and CEO of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I've worked in the correctional environment for almost 2 decades. And, now I'm kind of venturing out, doing some training, trying to help other civilians who step into the environment understand the reality of the environment before we waste valuable resources training these people who get in there and they have that culture shock, like, oh my God, I didn't realize this is what I was coming into. So that's really what the focus is, and certain areas that I think are crucial for your learning as you start to engage with the inmates.
It's funny, as you're talking, we also have someone just sent us a message. Love what we do. Say hi to Connie. And then I also got another message saying that someone just graduated from the academy out of Arizona. I'll see if I can show the pictures here if anybody could see it. Maybe tough to see, but
no, you could see it. That's cool.
You can see it? Yeah, they just graduated from the academy. He said, hello, Anthony. I finally finished my academy training and I wanted to give you an update. Because of your videos, I pushed myself and taught myself tactics and strategies to use in the field based off your content. I'm so excited to enter it in the line. And again, when we first talked, it gave me tremendous confidence. And I thank you for that. I'm assigned to my institution on Monday. I'm so excited. So I said, it's an awesome picture. Congrats. I love these pictures. And your comment humbles me. I mean, that's just, ain't that why we do it?
Yes.
Ain't that why we do it? You know, the reason why I wanted to have a topic like this today, guys, is because I have a feeling there's still issues when we have custody and civilian staffs trying to work together to complete their mission. I think part of that is because we may not understand each other's perspective to the point we need to be to work together. And I think it's key to kind of, when given the chances, to kind of have dialogue like this, to just try to see if we can smooth things over, just give a better understanding of what each party needs, and also, you know, basically what we expect from each other to help each other get the job done. Again, nothing in corrections is done in an isolated fashion. So, Connie, what do you think are some of the problems that we have, especially, again, with the relationship between custody and medical staff?
So I think the big thing is that, you know, officers spend almost 2 months, maybe depending on the system, in academy training with each other. That's time to bond, to get to know each other, to trust each other, to build relationships. And I feel that civilians don't typically get that opportunity to have that level of sort of training as well as camaraderie with officers. So right off the bat, you step into the facility, the civilian is the stranger, and there's this brotherhood that's already been built with people who you went through the academy with. So I think there's that trust factor that has to somehow get built over that time. And then I think there's like that next layer, which is we have different objectives. So like, I think, yes, the broader mission is safety and security, but like as a civilian, you're going there to provide whatever service you have to provide. And anything that comes in between you and providing that service is like, oh, come on, you know, I'm here to do this today. Why can't I get it done? And so it turns into like this adversarial almost relationship, as opposed to going in and saying, okay, this is what I need to accomplish. What kind of relationship do I need to establish with this officer so I can make this happen? Because the reality is that you need the officer in order to get the inmates, and you need the officer in order for you to be safe in that environment. So I think there's a little bit of inherent sort of, I don't know, barrier there. And I think you have to be intentional about like working that out.
And I'll tell you something. That's why shows like this are so important. That's why, again, guys, I know we're going live. Feel free to ask questions. I see some stuff starting to come in. We want to focus today on kind of working with civilian staff, dealing with specifically medical. We're going to touch on MATs, which is medical assisted treatment, so inmates that are taking Suboxone. And I also want to discuss officers carrying Narcan. But again, just going back to that relationship, right when I was an officer from the front line, I always made it my business to get to know everything that's going on around me. And I think by me trying to understand as much I can about the system, which by the way made me what I would like to think a good leader now, because I really got a chance to understand what corrections was about on a collective level, knowing that we don't work in isolation, knowing that we have to do what we can to get the mission done, but we have to do it together. And I started appreciating the people that work in the other departments, because I understood that they were just devoted to the mission as I was, but each one had maybe a different mission, but the goal was still the same. You know, at the end game, the goal was still the same. And I really started to respect the other departments by getting to know the people that represent the other departments. So I think that's key. By respecting the people, you start to represent, or you start to respect the departments that they work for. That's why when people ask me, Gangi, do you think inmates can change? I do, because I believe in the work that the people who facilitate that change. So yes, maybe when I was custody, I looked at things a little differently, and that was my fault. But as I started to move up in the field, I started to see the devotion of the other departments. And I really started to believe that, you know what, this really isn't an isolated mission. We really do all need each other. And just like I have devotion to get the job done, so do they. So, I mean, how important is that respect though, Connie? I mean, how important is that respect for us to kind of work together, but also respect the person that's working in that department?
So, I mean, I think respect is like crucial. That's like at the top. So one, I have to respect what you do. I have to respect what your priorities are. And I think that as an officer, that same respect has to be returned. I think sometimes that respect gets lost, sometimes in the degrees or like who this person believes they are, whether it's the chain, where you are in the chain of command on the custody side, or where you are, what you're doing on, you know, the civilian side. If you're the doctor and you feel somehow this officer shouldn't be talking to you about whatever, like I feel like the ego is not the place for us to kind of be able to work together there. I think that as long as we can respect that this is what your role is in order for us to like all get home safely, and this is my role in order for us to meet whatever those standards are or the requirements are as it relates to treatment or as it relates to having like a stable inmate population, then the reality is that we do have to work together. Because you think for a second, if you have you have an inmate who's sick, right, and the doctor just decided I'm not doing what I got to do today, you got to know that that's at some point gonna call, there's gonna be a code call, right? And now you've got officers responding to this code that could have been probably avoided, right? And now you've got people going out. It's like a whole trigger, the chain effect of everything that begins to break down because someone's ego might have gotten in the way. So the respect is major, because when one person isn't doing doing their job, there definitely could be a domino effect on what happens throughout that day.
I agree. And you know, it's funny. Someone just sent us a question. I think it's something that we actually can both answer, actually, because we both dealt directly with inmates. SSTHS says, "Hey, boss man, do you have any tips for getting compliance without raising your voice? Key here is respect, be firm, fair, and consistent. When inmates know what to expect from you, believe it or not, that level of expect, sorry, my mind's going blank. That fairness, that firmness, that confidence in how you carry yourself, that will come across without you raising your voice. But again, if you don't have that respect, and by the way, if you have to raise your voice all the time, it also looks like you've lost that level of control. I know individuals who are extremely quiet who can get the job done. But again, it is about that mutual respect. The inmates have to respect you, but in order for you to get that, you're going to have to respect them. I mean, that's the key. What do you think about that?
I absolutely agree. I mean, so for one, being a female, having worked with males, like I'm not yelling. Like that's just not what I'm gonna do. And so I've had to call, like I'm like, hey, come over here for a minute. Let me talk to you. Not because I'm having a secret conversation, but sometimes removing the inmate from the group.
Yes.
And really being able to like focus and say, like, what is it that you're really trying to accomplish right now? Because here are all the things that could go wrong if you continue down this path. Sometimes it's a matter of you taking control of the situation. And that doesn't mean you have to raise your voice. That just means you respect that person as an individual. Let me pull you aside and figure out what your issue is. And if we can work it out, we will. And if we can't, the answer's still going to be no.
Yeah. And you know what? You actually remind me of a story. When I first worked at the female facility, I found in my experience that the females challenged my orders a little bit more. So I found myself going, found myself going a little back and forth with them. And I remember there was this one female who just would always challenge everything I gave her. And I wind up going back and forth with her. I was going back and forth with her in front of other inmates. And the senior officer was just watching me, trying to see like how I'm going to navigate myself through this. And I didn't realize that I was losing control. I was just getting upset. Now here she is. She's following the order, but she's mouthy. And we were going back and forth. And I was like, you know, what's happening is I know you're doing it, but your mouth's going to get you in a lot of trouble. But we're kind of going back and forth. So the senior officer after a while says, hey, Gans, let me holler at you for a minute. I said, okay. So I go over there. I was like, what's going on? He goes, how do you think you're handling that? I think I'm all right. You know, she's getting the job done. Why am I doing something wrong? Now I'm already frustrated. And he sees it. He goes, Ganji, what you got to do, and you said it right there, Connie, is you got to take that inmate away from the other inmates. And that inmate's going to be totally freaking different than as if she was in front of them. So the next day in the same unit dealing with that same inmate. So this time what I did, went into the office, called the inmate into the office, shut the door, and then she like breathed like a sigh of relief, like, oh, like the show's over. Yes. I was like, what's going on? She goes, Ganji, as much as you're telling me what to do, the inmates are expecting me to kind of, mouth off a little bit. You know what I mean? So, and what's funny, I never had a problem with that inmate ever since, or at that time. So the thing is, you're right. You know, the respect came from actually just knowing the environment, pulling her away, and just kind of having that one-on-one. But definitely the yelling back and forth was not working. We were just competing with each other, and at the end, we both were just exhausted. You know, that was we got another. I like what Gary T says. This is for you, Connie. We do need to work together. I respect that medical has a job and needs to do it to protect licenses they worked hard for. Custody has to do our job because we have each other to protect. How important is what Gary just said?
That's really important. I mean, because I think so often there's this perception that like custody doesn't care that I have a job to do. They don't care about my license. They don't care. Like they only care about whatever's on their agenda for the day. And I think that the more we have these conversations, the more people realize that I do care that you guys are safe. I know what if like I didn't have the experience of getting like splashed or walking in and getting like exposed to something, right? But like for me as an administrator, that happens to somebody, like I feel that. That may not be my brother, that may not be someone that I went to the academy for weeks with, but I still care about the fact that that happened. And I think the more we have these conversations, the more we realize that we just care about other human beings. I get that in that role, by virtue of how things are broken up, that there are these little silos. But I mean, our reality is that silos can get us all hurt.
And you know, that's why I always tell people we don't work in isolated fashion. Success comes as a partnership, and so does failure. You know, Bonnie asked a good question about cross training, or what I would call cross perspective training. You know who introduced me to that? The same person introduced me to you, Gary Cornelius.
Yeah.
Actually, we're gonna have Gary on soon. He's going through a little something with his family right now. And of course, I want to send our well wishes out to him. We will have him on again very shortly. Maybe you could sit in on that one as well. But he's the one that brought into my mind the cross perspective training. He goes, it's just that simple as when you have those officers in that academy, bring those civilian department heads in, have them explain what their function is, and get them right from the beginning. Now, you actually have a training school as well. So I'm assuming that from your side, because it's a civilians correction academy, you're also trying to balance the needs of what we have to get out to the civilians, yes, but also the safety and security side of things, correct?
Absolutely. So essentially, safety and security is embedded in every class. And the whole purpose of that is making sure that civilians understand that no matter what your role is, safety and security has to always be present. It's not like you can say, oh, I got to treat this inmate, but I'm going to leave the syringes open. Right? Like you can't lose sight of like the environment that you're actually in and what could happen if you start doing stupid things just because, right? Like you're not in a traditional work environment. So the things you might do in your private practice aren't things that you would do in this environment. And you do have to safeguard yourself. So in every single class, the safety and security is embedded in the lesson.
And Gary even said, it's all about communication, speaking with each other, talking to each other. You know what's, I mean, it really is spot on. People don't realize how powerful we could be as an entity if we all got along with each other. I mean, think about the numbers. I mean,
yeah, or even just the leveraging of that collective intelligence, right? Because civilians have these sort of interactions with the inmates. You guys have a different interaction with the inmates. Suppose we actually just talked about what the inmate said to me today. Right? Like I remember there was an incident where like the inmate wrote this whole long letter, and administrator, you got to go through all the letters, respond to the letters within 24 to 48 hours and go through all the motions. And then if there's something that's of significant concern, I have to sit and talk with the inmate. And so the inmate then goes into this diatribe, oh, I'm gonna get this officer tonight, blah, 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 blah. And I'm saying to myself, so clearly, whether I take him serious or not, I need to let custody know that this inmate is threatening an officer. Whatever the situation happened in the housing unit, I wasn't there. It's not for me to judge it, but it is for me to share that information so that it's a safe night for everybody.
Right. And you know what? I wish we had more of that, because that communication is definitely needed. I think that right now, sometimes our animosity towards each other, for whatever reason, I hate that it's there, but it limits our ability to communicate. And the only people that strengthen from that are the inmates. You
Yep.
know, they love that divide. And I also want to mention something else. And then I want to maybe jump into the MATs a little bit. But we have a habit of, let's say I have a negative interaction with one person from one department. We have a habit of generalizing that interaction to the whole department. Like I remember I had to go speak at an event in Oklahoma. And it was a union sponsored event. Now, mind you, I'm not union anymore. I'm on the administrative level. So in my state, the administrative levels were not represented by unions, were appointed. And a lot of the unions were really bad mouthing administration, just in general, just, you know, administration, okay. I mean, it happens, you know. But then when I looked around, I saw that there were officers that were being honored and who was next to them, but they're administrators, you know, they're wardens, they're executive staff. So when I grabbed the microphone, I said, you know, what's funny is we have this generalized animosity when technically it could be just that one individual who happens to represent that department. And we need to move ourselves away from that because we don't realize how powerful we are when we are together. So when I saw that they were kind of having this generalized animosity, I'm looking at the administrators who are sitting there next to their officers, and you know they're disenfranchised. They're, you know, because they feel that they have value, they're trying to have a positive image, but they're caught up with that negative generalization. So just as a reminder, guys, when we have these concerns, sometimes the concerns really aren't like a representation of the whole department. Sometimes it's just that one individual, but now we become biased to the department in general, and we have to do what we can not to allow that to happen. And I want to stress that because at the end of the day, we need each other. There's no ifs and buts about that. We need each other. And this generalized hatred only weakens us. I mean, would you agree, Connie, or?
I absolutely agree. And I mean, so quite frankly, leadership sets the tone, right? And so if in the presence of leadership, there's sort of this negative engagement happening, or there's like negative talk or whatever there is, I feel that there's also a responsibility. I know we don't want to ruffle feathers, and a lot of things is a lot like there's tons of politics involved, and how to navigate those relationships can be very challenging. But I also feel like if as a leader and I'm an officer and I see my captain or my lieutenant or whomever sort of being negative, like then I take the cue that it's okay for me to do that, you know? And so there's got to be a point where we kind of take a look in the mirror. We say we're unhappy with these relationships and the way things are going, but then we're also a part of the problem as opposed to being part of the solution. So how do we take a step back and say, hey, listen, you know what? You said such and such the other day. That really is that particular individual. You know, let's deal with that issue as opposed to it being something that can fester and sort of infect the entire department or the unit.
Well, Scott D says Connie is speaking the truth right here. Yeah, so I think Connie appreciates that, Scott, right, Connie?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so there's two touchy subjects I want to touch on right now. One is officers carrying Narcan. The other is the MAT. Let's start with the MAT. Let's get an understanding of what this medical assisted treatment's about. So let's get it from a medical side first to see, you know, is this really something needed? What's the plan here? Is there an end game on this? And, you know, let's see it. You know, Connie's very well aware. She has a great balance between the needs of custody and also the needs of her medical staff. So obviously when she presents her discussion, she's going to present it from a very objective perspective that notes both concerns, you know, including the concerns that custody is now having to supervise this. And they may feel that we don't want to supervise this. This really isn't something that we should be held responsible for. And then again, a lot of people also feel that people could get high off the Suboxone. So you're treating an addict who, you know, is trying to fight addiction, and now you're giving them a drug that they feel they can get addicted on again. So it's like a drug for a drug. And the other concern that we had recently was that when you have inmates that are abusing Suboxone that aren't really on the MAT, they wind up getting written up the charge for misusing the Suboxone, but then they wind up getting put on the MAT program. So I don't know if you had that, but that happens. So let's explain the need for the MAT program. How does that work? How does an inmate get themselves into this program?
All right. So each system, I don't know how all systems are set up, but there is a criteria for you to even qualify to get into medication assisted treatment, right? In some states, it is that they have to have proof that you are in treatment or that you have a history of this opioid use disorder or an addiction issue, right? Usually upon intake, when you do your intake screening, where I worked, they had like a cup. They'd go give their urine sample in a cup. The cup would pretty much highlight all the possible drugs that came up in the person's system. If we could confirm that this person was receiving, if there was like an opioid in their system, essentially there was a review process for how that person would get inducted into medication assisted treatment. So that may vary from facility to facility, but there is a process. It can't just be you come up and be like, hey, I want this, right? And if you do come up, maybe this person was flying under the radar. Medical still has to do their due diligence to make sure this person either qualifies or does not qualify. The real issue here, though, is that it's almost as though, like, if someone comes into the facility and they're diabetic, we don't decide like we're going to take away their insulin. Like, we continue with their insulin or whatever diet, whatever treatment they were getting in the community. Someone comes in and they're hypertensive, we make sure they still get their medication. So if someone comes in and they were receiving treatment in the community, they would continue to get that treatment. So the weaning off process is very challenging, especially if you're in a jail and you've not yet been sentenced, as opposed to if you have been sentenced. Some facilities do have an end game. So if you've been sentenced and they know you're going to be down for 10 years, some facility will begin the weaning off process because you're going to be there for 10 years. Some facilities, they have the process of, we're going to maintain you on it because, as we know, many people who aren't maintained end up looking for the alternative. They end up looking for some sort of black market way. I mean, I know we don't want to talk about being able to get drugs in the facilities, but they find other ways to meet that need. From the medical side, though, when you aren't treating someone and they start going through withdrawal, there's a very high probability of that person going and having seizures, vomiting. Like, there's a whole process of what that detox looks like and what it could actually do to your body. So if you're already medically compromised, it kind of puts you in an even worse position as you start to like decompensate on your own without any sort of medical intervention. So the point of this medication assisted treatment is to make sure like you have addicts who are stable in the environment. Not that you're giving them more drugs, but you're helping to suppress that craving for the drug that they're addicted to. Now, what we know now is that 75% of people who were in prison or jail who had like an opioid use disorder have experienced a relapse. And those people are 10 to 40 times more likely to die of an opioid overdose. And so the point is, you don't want that to happen.
It's funny. This compliment where the room's filling up, the compliment we just got from Scott. This is the most truthful and honest dialogue I've heard in a very long time.
Nice.
Scott, if you were the only person in my audience right now watching, that's the compliment that makes it worthwhile. Absolutely. I mean, that is a tremendous compliment. CKES, I believe he's out of Connecticut. They use methadone. So what are the different types of, what would it be, drugs? What are the different types of medication that are used?
You can do methadone. I think it's Suboxone. There's Subutex. And there's one more which slips me right now.
Okay, but so
pretty much one is more expensive than the other. So depending on the scale, and some people who come in who are already being treated, they may get whatever one they're already being treated with.
Yeah, something once in a while I'm trying to keep things tracked with the the MATs, but Aiden did ask a question, just wants our opinion on it. So it's a little off topic. But of course, out of respect, I do want to answer that. Aiden does follow the show. Obviously, we have the let's see. So if I can ask, what's your guys' opinions on Florida not evacuating prisoners in Dorian? I'll go first. I'm sure you've dealt with that too. Evacuations are very tricky situation. I mean, there's just so much that could go wrong during evacuation. I think sometimes they weigh the risk, because sometimes there's even a greater risk of just evacuating the inmates and all the things that have to go with that, including medical concerns. I mean, it's a crazy plan. So, I mean, I'm sure that when they made that decision, they weigh it out and they try to fortify where they're at to make sure that, okay, I think we're good here. And, everything's a risk because you could evacuate and then you could have greater concerns. So you have to weigh out the concerns of the inmates, but also the concerns of the community. You kind of have, and the concerns of staff as well. So, I mean, if that's the decision they made, I believe they made the decision based on the information that's provided and where the greater risk would be. And I think at that point, maybe the greater risk is doing this evacuation and it putting the community as well as the inmate staff just at a greater risk. I mean, would you think that, Connie, same?
Absolutely. I mean, I had the experience with Hurricane Sandy of us having to evacuate, and that was I mean, when I say we opened the command center and it was like, okay, it was very strategic. Medical records, medication. If someone had narcotics, there was a whole process surrounding narcotics and how you move that from one location to another and securing it. And then it was the whole transportation piece. Then you add insult to injury, which is you have to manage that population, which is managing classifications. If someone has a profile against somebody and all the other stuff that comes along with it. So if a decision was made to actually not evacuate, it would have to be because it was safer to keep the inmates where they are.
I agree. And Scott even says at the end of the day, administrators have to do what's best for public safety. And that's a great question, Aiden. Thank you for asking. And thanks for commenting, guys. Going back to the MATs, what gets me, just going back to what you said. So if you have an inmate in jail, I do expect the MATs to kind of be there because, again, you got inmates that are coming from the streets that are fighting the addictions and the withdrawal. But what still gets to me is when you have an inmate in prison and let's say they've been clean for years and now you're putting them on the MAT, I just don't see the relevance in that because, in my opinion, is they've been battling through the addiction and now we're providing them with something that, it's been years they haven't touched a drug. I don't understand why we're going to have to introduce them to that.
See, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for what's happening across the board. I know that this whole process is evidence-based, right? Which essentially means there's been enough studies to say that this actually works. This keeps individuals safe, right? So inducting someone who hasn't used in years, would be questionable. But I also know that oftentimes people have not used in years might start using because of the stress of the situation that they're currently in. So we acknowledge that being in prison, being in jail kind of brings on some of the old habits that you probably hadn't picked up in a long time. And now, at least if you are being maintained, that crave that might start to be present or manifest itself is now still being suppressed by the assisted treatment.
Well, CK has also mentioned that a lot of the facilities have strict guidelines. I agree with that. Some facilities actually, the strict guidelines come upon the distribution of the medication and the partnership between medical and custody, making sure that the inmate is taking the medication and not, taking it back to their cell or whatever it is. So what are some of the policies or procedures you see in play when it comes to that distribution and the partnership between medical and custody to make sure we're doing it safe and secured?
So as far as distribution goes, the medication is in a locked area and there's one inmate to the window at a time. The inmate has to come with cups of water so that they're swallowing in front of the nurse. they're being given X amount of time to stand up, and for the officer, so the nurse does a mouth check after the inmate has swallowed. Then you have the officer who's also doing a mouth check, and the inmate has to wait for like at least 10 or 15 minutes before they're allowed to go back to the housing unit. So you do have the layer of nursing staff trying to ensure that the medication is gone down. They even, some places I've seen them give them an additional cup of water while they're still waiting. So that's just really trying to make sure like that medication goes down. I do believe that the partnership is, if the nurse hasn't seen something, because the inmate knows how to, you know, hide the medication under their tongue or cheek it so that it doesn't quite dissolve, you still have the officer who's there to kind of help make sure that the medication was taken.
You know, let me ask a question though. So I know you mentioned one at a time. Does that slow down the med line, or is the MAT? I got actually two questions here. Is the MAT run separate from the med line? And if so, when you announce MAT, is that a violation of HIPAA because you're saying that these are what the inmates are taking?
No, so the way we had it set up is Medline was not the same as MAT. So you had two different med lines. So you had meds called in the morning, and then they would just say meds. But I mean, I think of course over time, anyone who's going for 2 o'clock Medline, they know that that's MAT, right? But it's just Medline. You could be getting a PM dose of something, but it's usually not at 2 o'clock. But it was very clear that inmates came in the morning for meds. That was the first round of meds. And then there was another Medline called at around 2.
Okay, so there's no problem with having that separate med line though, right? Because
No.
I know in some facilities, there's a good amount that go and they wind up having to do it separately. In some facilities, if there's enough custody staff, they may actually have 6 to 7 inmates at a time line up. And I believe it may be like a 7 or 8 minute, like per inmate, like you put the Suboxone, if it's, let's say it's Suboxone, and then you you give them about 7 minutes for it to dissolve, and then you go back and check their mouths. And I know that they have water in their mouth before, but is there a problem with them drinking the water after?
I don't think there's a problem with them drinking it after, no. I know that we've seen in one facility, we've seen inmates drink the water the first time, try to cheek it, and then drink the water the second time, but the second time try to spit the fluid into like their undershirt, which it would be under the uniform top, so that you couldn't see that their shirt was wet, and they can take that shirt back to the unit and sell it. So they've actually gotten to a point where they were looking at like shirts, at jumpers, at whatever they were wearing when they came down. So it was almost like getting an inspection as well, when, you know, like not necessarily a search, but the officer was definitely looking if it looked as though the inmate was trying to divert.
Now, let me ask you a question. If they're able to take, let's say for some reason, let's say they're able to mount up that Suboxone and bring it back to their cell, can they overdose over that?
Not that I know of. I mean, I know that if they have a good amount of any medication, you can overdose on it. But the dosages that they get in facilities are not significant enough, I think, for them to overdose unless they can collect a significant amount over a period of time.
Now, I know that because they consider a program or a treatment, it's not just medical, it's mental health involved in that. What about custody? Are they involved in that?
So with MAT, a true MAT program has a mental health component that deals with more the behavioral side. That's the therapeutic and the counseling side. The medication is just a piece of it. And in most facilities, in order for you to qualify to continue receiving the medication, you have to be in treatment with mental health. And so one process that I've seen in place is that if someone didn't show up for their visit with the psychiatrist or with their social worker, like essentially they were evaluated to be weaned off.
Yeah, because that's actually, I know we have that concern. And also, I know we discussed about the end dates, But if you have inmates, not all states have community release programs, but some states do. Do we try to, if they're still on MAT, let's say when they're leaving prison, is that something they continue when they get released?
Yes, they're supposed to. So essentially, any reentry efforts, especially if someone is in treatment, that reentry activity or the discharge plan should actually include where they would be transitioning that MAT treatment to. So if they're where their new methadone clinic is, and like any records that we have internally should be getting sent to the receiving sort of facility.
And Connie, we still have to have discussion about the MAT and juveniles.
Yeah, I know.
That's something that I think has not been discussed yet, and I think that would be great for us to kind of start that discussion. Now, guys, the reason why we're mentioning this is corrections has so many different perspectives, and I just think it's worthy to kind of get an understanding because each perspective kind of blends into another perspective. So believe it or not, understanding MATs and why it's being done is also a good way for you to understand what your purpose is in all this. Because again, custody is involved in everything that happens inside those facilities. So it's good for us to know the reasoning. So when we make decisions behind it, we know why those decisions need to be. So we kind of make better decisions. Recently, corrections is evolving. We know that. And we're going to be introduced to a lot of things that are very strange and unfamiliar to us at first. And I think it's that way because we don't take kind of the time to really understand why these things are being implemented. And even if we're to challenge it, because maybe we just don't think it's the right thing, because trust me, guys, there's a lot of things I don't agree with that we kind of have to go through the motions with. Even though we kind of want to challenge the things, they're going to happen. I mean, that's the evolution of it all. So when we come in and say, hey, guys, what do you think we need to do to make this work? We don't want the answer that it can't be done. Because the thing is it has to get done. So this is your chance to, okay, we know we have to get this done. How do we work it out? Because it's sad when you have someone from above looking in and saying, hey, guys, I'm asking you how it can get done. You're telling me it can't be done. But now here I am. I go on a unit and I'm able to fix things that are so simplistic. And it's like, okay, you're not even making the effort at this point, guys. And then when I say, you know what, if you're not going to help out, well, then we're going to make it happen anyway. The problem is you're not going to have an influence on it now. Now you're pissed off. But hey, we gave you the chance. You were resistant. And now the problem here now is we're moving on without you. So anytime you're given a chance that we have to implement something new and you have management who really does care and go to you and says, hey, listen, we have to get this done. How do we get this done? Really exhaust all efforts.
But I think in all fairness, right, when you're very close to the thing, whatever that thing is, it's hard for you to see that there's another way for you to do it, right? Like, I think when you have a little distance from a situation, it's easy for you to come in and something that seems quite obvious, you're like, I didn't even look at it that way. And I don't think it's because necessarily someone's resisting the change. It could just be like they can't see how it could be done some way different. So I think that's just, I think, a normal dynamic when it comes to change, right? Some people just resist change and some people really just can't see how it could be done differently. So I get it. You do want to be able to influence how this thing could happen. But I think you also have to be clear that by the time it comes to you, like a decision has already been made that is gonna happen. So like, that's really the time for you to really get the wheels turning and say, okay, how am I going to work this so it doesn't disrupt the unit? How do I work this so that it doesn't make my job that much more easier?
And you know what? What's funny, Connie, you still there? Because I think I lost you for a second.
Yes, I'm still here. For some reason,
Oh, you're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah, it was like timed out or something. It's like, do we trust you?
Yeah, and you know what's funny? I just want to say just some of the comments. So CKaz, when we were saying our thoughts, CKaz goes, hey, great point, Gangi. And then Connie comes in and says her point, and he's like, great point, Connie. Connie's right too. So, but it's great. That's why we have to have these dialogues, because I agree with Connie. Maybe some people just don't know, and you have to kind of reintroduce them into the way of things. But again, when we're talking about the resistance, you have that too, where they know, and now they don't want to get involved. And the problem is at this point, like what Connie said, you're going to have to do the change. So the problem here is if you don't, you get left behind. But Aiden says something that's really unique. that I thought was a great thought. Aiden says, oh no, I'm sorry, Holy Cat said it. I'm sorry, Holy Cats. I think part of the problem is trying to implement policies without changing post orders or directives. If something were to go wrong, the block cop gets thrown under the bus. I agree. I'll go first. I know Connie's going to want to jump on this too, but I agree, guys. Anytime that there's something coming down the pike, yeah, the policies have to change, and you have to see that also in the post orders for the officers. And obviously, one thing as management is also to hold those, besides getting the information out there and making sure the officers understand, the other view for management is I'm also going to hold the officer liable. I given them the information, and you know, now this puts them on Front Street saying how you have to get it done. But you're right, guys. Sometimes you have these policies that are put out there, and the post orders aren't there, and unfortunately, the front line gets kind of confused because they don't really have a step-by-step direction as what actually needs to be done, and it's very hard to hold them liable because, again, there's nothing in the post orders holding them to commit to that position. Have you had that? I mean, you've dealt with a lot of changes, Connie. Have you seen that?
So, I mean, I think a lot of, for medical, one of the things that we really had a struggle with in the beginning is like just transportation to court, right? Because it happens so early in the morning, like you get medication, you're supposed to get meal, like there's all these, it's like a chain of things that need to happen in order for the inmate to get on that bus in the morning and make it to their appointment, whatever appointment that is. And I recall us having situations where, you know, inmate, particularly for an MRI, right? Inmate goes to go get an MRI. They're very like anxious, this, that, the third. So like 2 hours before they go get on the bus, they're supposed to get this medication that kind of calms them down so that they can go and sit through the whole MRI process. And so this was already decided that this is what we would be doing in this particular situation for inmates who are being transported for an MRI. And so the regular officer on the post knew that this was happening. So it was part of his process, but his post orders were never changed. And so moment he's not there, that morning, an inmate's supposed to go out, she doesn't get her medication and it becomes a thing. And I'm like, okay, so this has been happening for the last year or so. The post orders still haven't caught up to, you know, what should be done. And the officer wasn't wrong for not getting her to meds 2 hours early. The post orders don't tell the officer to do that. And there were no special instructions attached either. And so here's this big miscommunication. Inmate misses the appointment. The specialty clinic no longer wants to do business with the facility and all the other craziness that comes along with that. But it's like, here are some of the simple things that, you know, could be in place, and the reality is that there are always going to be changes. But I feel like the administrative directives, the post orders, all that stuff has to keep up with the changes that are happening so rapidly in the industry.
And like you said, it also keeps with the consistency. You know, with these posts come that specific job for that post. So if you don't have that listed in the post orders, one thing is there's a good chance that that officer is not going to know those things have to be done. And second thing is, even if they do, they're not going to know how to implement it. And a lot of officers are afraid, or even just staff members in general, are afraid to employ discretion because they feel that if they make a left or right, management's going to hold them responsible. And now that only gives us a hesitant force. So when you want something done, a lot of people do want that step-by-step guideline because they know if I follow this, technically I should be protected. But I'm going to be honest with you, very rarely in corrections does everything follow that step-by-step. I mean, you know, we wind up in a world of shit, and you really have to let your front line have that discretion.
Absolutely.
But a lot of good comments coming in now. I'm trying to read them all. People love the dialogue, great points, incredible analysis here. I like what Holy Cat said again. He goes, I'll do whatever needs to be done, but I want it done on paper. And I agree. And again, that's just for that liability sake. And Scott D says, so much truth being told here. Sometimes officers are afraid to make decisions. Yeah, not just officers.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, obviously, you know what's funny, guys? I'll tell you a little something else again, and then I think we could talk about Narcan a little bit. As you move up, you start to see the bigger picture. And that's with any department. When you're the front line, you kind of see the immediate picture. But I always tell people when you get a chance, look to the left and right, see what the other people are doing. But technically, you're really focused on what your responsibilities are. As you start to move up, you really start to see slowly but surely the interactions with the other departments and just that ripple effect. On the administrative level, all you see are the interactions with the other departments and trying to keep the balance between all departments, not really just civilian versus custody. I mean, there's different types of civilian departments that go against each other because again, they may not realize each other's mission, and then they just kind of war with just the path that they're taking to get there that has some form of conflict. But in the end, it's really about being able to utilize that discretion. So policy and procedures are really the lifeblood of a facility. That's the growth. That's based on the failures and successes of what has worked and what hasn't worked. As you move up, leadership should have a little bit more discretion when it comes to policy and procedure, only because not everything's, A to B. Sometimes you have to scramble just to get things back into policy. But again, if you have a force that becomes very hesitant because of management always looking to micromanage every decision they make, you're going to wind up having a facility that's going to fall back in practices because, again, no one's looking to make any decisions that can make things easier. Just if that's what policy says, that's what policy says. And at the end of the day, you're going to wind up having staff that's going to freeze at the moments where you want them to be active.
Yep.
So I just want you guys to know that, as you start to move up, management really start letting those supervisors really, if need be, employ a little bit of discretion in how they maneuver if need be. All because it's in policy doesn't mean it's set in stone. And all policies and procedures, even post orders, are meant to evolve. Absolutely. Hey, this worked well yesterday, it's not working today, we got to go ahead and fix it. But that's how you create those great policies. But if you don't listen to staff, those policies are going to fall behind and you wind up, operating a facility that's just not moving forward in any way.
And sometimes it's just the smallest thing. It's a slight change. If we just did this thing, it wouldn't create such a bad impact, whatever that is. Because I know that there was a time where, we would be going through, it was so simple as like, so anytime we wanted to see like whatever inmates, we would give a list the night before to the officers, like to the lieutenant, and the lieutenant would deliver them to the housing units. And I'm like, why do we do this list the night before when that list changes all the time? Is there any way for us to do this list in a way that, well, actually they wanted a week in advance so that they could kind of plan for, staffing and all that other stuff, which I think that's the ideal case. But like, if you do it a week in advance and you've had a ton of inmate movement, you now have a week of obsolete lists. So you're never going to see those people because they're no longer in the facility. They transferred, they this, they that. Okay, fine. So then I was like, well, maybe we can just give, even if you want this list in advance, we can also probably give you a list from the night before. That way, if there was any movements or anything like that, when you get it, that list has now been adjusted and you don't have the officer now looking up this whole list to make sure all these people are still in their unit. And if they're not in the unit anymore, they're also now calling the unit they were transferred to, making the morning kind of crazy, trying to organize all these lists and all these inmates that got to be seen by multiple disciplines. And I feel like sometimes it's just listening to one person who might have a suggestion that would make life easier for all of us. And it can't always just be like, if I didn't come up with the idea, it's not going to work.
And what's funny? It goes back to what Gary said about communication.
Mm-hmm.
It really does stem from communication. Before we get to Narcan, Mark Ivory had mentioned something, and we have to do a topic on this. You know what? I think Connie would be the perfect person for this, actually. This is just a statement, but he says in California, the prison he worked at specialized in treating inmates with medical and mental health illnesses. The officers' programming covered inmate health welfare. So again, we're dealing with the training. So anytime you see, let's say the MAT being introduced, or we're getting an increase in inmates with mental health concerns, I believe custody should be involved in training just to kind of see why it's needed and where their role is. I mean, when MAT got introduced, I would hope that they didn't introduce it blindly without giving custody some level of training as to why it's needed and what's their role.
I would hope so too.
I mean, it's very important, but it's crazy how sometimes they just go ahead and implement something without really giving that formalized training. But once you give that formalized training, that training gives the understanding, and most likely you wind up with that understanding getting staff that's more willing.
Yes.
You know, I think that's the key. Okay, we're gonna have one. I have one off question, and we're gonna go to Narcan, and then we could get a little breather. Now we can go. You know, I got to watch it tonight, guys, because I want to see the sequel next week. So I have to rewatch it tonight. Yeah, I like My Heart. I work in a prison, Connie. Don't be surprised.
Oh I cannot bring myself to watch it.
I have to. I like the first one, you know. So I want to answer steak sauce question. Hey, steak sauce. This is an A1 type question. Let's see. In a secure level 1, if a prisoner is violent in any way against anyone, prisoners included, do you think that prisoners should be transferred out of that level 1 facility or moved to a new unit? So I could attack this first, and maybe you could. There's a level of that you could touch on. But I would like to say something right now. You know what's funny, guys? When you have inmates that are highly problematic, because right now you have the push away from solitary confinement, which I hate that term. We all know it's not solitary confinement. Inmates at this point, they're not locked away and forgotten about. We give them programming. We try to keep them double cell, but in some cases, there are inmates that you just cannot partner with anybody. For those inmates that are a threat, mental health can actually deem those inmates as maybe a single cell only, or in some cases you have inmates that are suicidal that mental health may say those inmates need to be double celled only, you know, in case the inmate's suicidal and a danger to themselves. But for this case here, if you have an inmate that poses a threat and they're a high threat to safety and security, then yes, that inmate has to be removed. I don't want to use the word isolated, but at the end of the day, here's the difference from the practices of yesterday to today. This inmate is not placed in an area where they're forgotten. What's going to happen is they're going to get moved to an area where there could be more intense programming, more intense one-on-one sessions to try to better the inmate in an effort to move the inmate forward. The liability comes from the fact that if you have an inmate that has a history of assaulting other inmates, the problem is that when you go to house them with somebody, and now you have a record of this inmate doing that, it opens up a liability to the family who has a loved one that does get assaulted. So I think the problem here, and I don't know if Connie would agree here, is that when the outside kind of pushes for the rights of one, they may not realize how that rights of one is affecting the rights of the many. And now we have a safety issue. I'm not going to touch too much on this, but in general, and I'm going to avoid this topic, but I'm just going to put something out there. Transgender inmates, but I'm leaving it be. I'm not going to touch it. Connie, I recommend you don't touch it at this point. But when we retire, it's game on.
Absolutely.
It's game on.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about, you know, this just real quick, just to answer Steak Sauce's question. You know, when the inmate is a threat to others, you know, at that point, wouldn't it be better to say, you know what, at this point, for the safety of the others, we have to separate this inmate? But again, are they forgotten?
Not that I'm aware of. So yes, they do get separated. And I mean, I think you answered it like 100%. You know, it is, especially if this is an inmate who probably wasn't always, they didn't come in behaving the way they are. So from a medical mental health perspective, you kind of want to explore what sort of brought on this impulsivity. Is there something else happening in the unit that caused this inmate to behave this way, to lash out, or whatever the case may be? And is there some treatment that this inmate needs to be in, or some programming in order to get this inmate stabilized? Like, that's just the reality. So even if something happens, the inmate doesn't just get taken away and then he's forgotten about, or she.
I got one last question before we go to Narcan. Hey, but one thing that Steak Sauce says about the, you know, I want to mention something, guys, real quick. Our job has an inherent risk to it. That's why we you have the environment that really is supposed to do what it can to protect you. But we do have an inherent risk. And at all times, we are looking to get inmates to be prepared to re-enter society, because most inmates are going to be exiting the facilities. So we're the ones that are going to be the pilot program for that, if you will. So there's going to be a lot of failures, and it sucks. but unfortunately, we don't want the inmate going directly out to society. So the failures happen with us. You know why, guys? Because we're the best suited to do it. We're the best suited to handle it. And that's when management has to find a way to make sure that the environment's as safe as can be before we put our warriors inside that wall. But remember, guys, these inmates, they're going to fail a lot sometimes, and we're going to have to be there to control that. But all efforts always going to be to stabilize that inmate and give them that other opportunity, unless it gets to a point where they actually said, you know what, which is, it happens, not a lot, but it could happen to the point where people are like, you know what, this is just not working for this inmate. And now it's costing, it really is the safety and integrity of the facility, but that has to be justified beyond belief. But again, you're still not forgetting about that inmate, but you're managing that inmate in a much closer setting and letting the other population, letting the rest of the population be given that chance to thrive. SSTHS asks this a good question, Connie. And I'm going to have you go first. Just I'm going to piggyback off your answer, Connie.
Okay.
I'm going to have you pioneer. You're going to trailblaze on this one. All right. So Anthony and Connie, what do you think about the attempts to make prisons more pleasant? Things like calling inmates residents or giving them tablets and switching away from jumpsuits. So we're looking at California, I believe. So go ahead, Connie. Is that it? Can you answer that safely, or you want me to cover that?
So I do think that, you know, you treat someone like an animal, they will behave like an animal, right? But I also feel that we cannot put on the rose-colored glasses and pretend that if we just change our dialogue, that it will change the nature of the beast, right? Like, so I was sitting on a panel where we were talking about this whole plan to close Rikers. And in that plan, it was bringing sort of the borough concept back into play and having this borough concept be a part of like a mall. And like, in my mind, I'm like, this is clearly someone who created this that wasn't quite aware of the nature of the population. Not that they cannot change. I do believe that they can change. However, I also know that when given an opportunity to manipulate a vulnerability, that there's very few inmates who won't take that opportunity to use it to their advantage. I'm trying to pick my words right here, Anthony. The reality, I think, is that yes, creating a more an environment that resembles more of a community can have a positive effect on this the mindset of being institutionalized. Right. I believe that it can have a positive effect on the population. I'm just not sure how effective that will be.
Okay, so, all right, so I agree with that. Mind you, in my thing, I'm in charge of all programmers, so I cannot dismiss what you just said. And I know my audience definitely can't dismiss that. I agree with that. The labels are very important. Now, from a safety and security side, we always have to remember who we're dealing with. So in the back of our mind, changing the terms could change how we view those individuals. So my concern is going to be the resident perspective, the student perspective, you know, that softer label could make it tough for the individual to remind themselves that this person's an inmate. You know, I know it may sound funny, but labels do matter. And I think when that plan was put into place, I don't think custody was involved in that at all to talk about, hey, guys, remember, when an inmate goes to manipulate, not all inmates, guys, but a selected few, they look to make you forget your prescribed role, and that's connecting with you on a personal level. The only way they can do that is, I'm not an inmate, therefore, you're not custody or you're not working here. So that label to me is important. I will say one thing, though, guys, with the tablets and stuff. I'm okay with keeping inmates busy. All right. If that's something that keeps their mind busy and something that we could take away that they value, I'm okay with that as long as it's not a safety and security concern. Because you got to remember something, guys. In prison, people are more motivated by a loss than a gain. So if you want to give them something and they enjoy it, and it's not a safety risk, well, then you know what? That gives the officer more power, if administration allows it, to say, listen, inmate's acting foolish, you lose your JPay. So, or you lose your tablet. I'm actually okay with it as long as it doesn't pose a security risk. If the inmate values it, that actually can put a lot more power into the officer's hand. But again, as long as that's supported by administration, giving the officer the power or the discretion to do that. Hey, you're going to get this, but if you act up or you do something foolish, but I will tell you one thing: if you do something inappropriate with it, there should be a zero tolerance, which means that you just messed this up. Now you never get it back. You know, and I wish we'd stick through with those zero tolerances. Unfortunately, we tend to weaken up on that. So now what I would like to kind of go on, because we're getting, hey, if you could see the room, there's tons of comments in here, and they're great comments. Let me just read a few more comments, and then we're going to go to the Narcan. I have another gentleman here by the name of XL. He's trying to get into the NJDOC. Hypothetically, I heard the NJDOC is a great place to work. I wouldn't know anything about that, but I heard good things. Their academy, from what I hear, is very tough. One of the toughest academies in the country. There's some good YouTube videos on their academy. All I could say is prepare yourself. Don't take nothing personal, because I think in all academies, they're trying to build you up. I think they're trying to set a foundation, and just work on competing against yourself. Make yourself better every day. It's not about the person that can do 150 push-ups in 60 seconds. It's about you maybe starting off with 10 and then by the end doing 50. You know, it's about self-improvement, showing them the fact that you have heart. If you have heart and you're willing to push yourself the extra mile, and you listen to those instructors and you build that bond, I really do think you'll be okay. And show support each other. And again, you know what's funny? You may hate it when you're there, but when you start getting into your career, you'll realize that the academy may have been some of the best times I've had. You know, that's just, you know, my opinion on that. And Scott said NJDOC is elite. I wouldn't know about that, Scott. Maybe. I just gotta be very careful here. Okay, so real quick, I want to touch on Narcan. And Seth, not all correctional officers are law enforcement. Some states are, some states aren't. That's always the big battle I have. I will say Jersey is pioneered when it comes to, New Jersey's actually called New Jersey Senior Correctional Police Officers. So we are law enforcement, and we do have the title of police officers in Jersey, but not all states have that, and that's the fight. I started that. One of my first articles for Correction 1 was, yes, corrections is law enforcement, and then having approved that through the article. So let me ask you a question. Let's talk a little bit about Narcan. What exactly is Narcan, and when should it be employed?
All right, so Narcan is a chemical that either can temporarily stop or reverse an overdose on an opioid or on heroin. It's life-saving. I mean, literally, you can buy it over the counter. You can go to Walgreens or CVS or what have you and buy it and have it. And, you know, it's either administered nasally or through an injection. Personally, I think Narcan is great, especially given the high number of overdoses that we've seen over the last years and the increase that we've seen. And I think with Narcan, that's definitely helped to sort of intervene. In the facility, I mean, I guess we would like to think that no one's using drugs in the facility. So why do we need the Narcan would be one discussion. But given that it's a reality, I do believe that officers, or there at least being Narcan available, sort of like there's a defibrillator probably in different points or parts of the compound or in different facilities, it's laid out differently, but some life-saving equipment is available. I think that should be the same with Narcan. Officers are closer to the inmates. So while on one end, I can see that argument, you know, I'm not medical, I should just be able to call a code, medical comes running with the Narcan and they administer and do all that goodness. The other end is, well, hey, you're in the unit with the inmates. You're there. So when you're thinking life saving, you're thinking you don't want, a death in the facility. Like, this is just what we need to do. Now, I do believe that you shouldn't just be given the Narcan and sent on your way. Like, if you have it, you should have been trained on what you should do. You should be trained on, how to identify that someone is overdosing. Like, what are the signs and symptoms? It shouldn't just be that you're kind of like sort of trial by fire, you figure it out. I think there should be a formal process in place that if an officer is going to be held responsible for intervening and using Narcan with anyone, because who knows who's using, right? That they should at least have some requisite training on how to actually use it. Now, when you think about like, so what is the discipline? I mean, I could see as an officer thinking I could possibly get a discipline for, like, I'm not medical. This is not what I got this job for. I don't want that responsibility, right? Like, so I can see that argument being made either way. I'd be interested to actually see how the union kind of supports or doesn't support officers having to actually administer Narcan. Now, the parallel that I kind of see is I'd gone through a prison nursery training where they wanted to bring in a prison nursery into the facility. And officers were like, I was not trained to do CPR on an infant. I'm not trained to handle babies. Like, that's just not my training. I don't want that responsibility. At the same token, administration couldn't say only women could be on this post because women would be the ones to care for these babies. Like, so like, I can see how this is a very touchy subject.
Well, what's funny here is that even though there's resistance, I think a lot of people now realize that it's good for custody to have it because custody is also being affected by the overdoses, especially with the fentanyl. And sometimes, what's sad is, I'll tell you what's happening now is that we used to kind of, inmate has a heart attack, running to the codes, do what you got to do. Now with fentanyl, we're hesitant. We don't know if it's a heart attack. We don't know if it's an overdose. And now we're just not running in anymore. And those overdoses have affected our response because we're nervous. We don't know, again, is this a heart attack or whatnot? But I'm actually for carrying the Narcan. Again, I'm responsible for that inmate's life, no matter what the choices they make, but I'm also responsible for my partner's life. So having the Narcan in my hand, it gives me that chance to give that one last effort. So I'm not 100% against it. Again, we need the training. But again, I find that right now, I believe now they're actually giving it to dog handlers now too, because of the dogs are just simply overdosing. Now, guys, we're going to start coming to an end because it's getting a little late. Gary says, thank you so much. Laura, we just have a lot of comments going on. I want to get this up. I know Connie wants to rest. But do you guys have any, Connie, you have any closing thoughts for the audience?
I just want to say it was fun. At first you were like, oh, you're going to love it. I'm like, I don't know. But I think it's good to have the dialogue. And I think it's good when, you have credible people who you can say, okay, I can trust what this person's saying, or that sounds like nonsense. I mean, I think just being able to hear people appreciate us having the conversation, I think it says a lot. These conversations need to be happening locally as well. Yes, this is a great platform. And I think it's also on the outside looking in, there has to be some sensitivity. I think that especially if you have people who are still in the field, there are some things that they can and can't talk about. And so I think being able to ask really great questions to help us facilitate some discussions that we wouldn't normally just bring up on our own, I think is really good. So I did have a great time and your audience is great.
Yeah, when you go back, if you get a chance, like you got to read some of these comments. I mean, they're just compliment. You even had a comment where someone said how pretty you are.
Oh,
So
thank
I've never gotten that. So I'm kind of upset. But hey, you got it, so that's good. Hey guys, Connie hit it right on the head, man. This is great dialogue. It's a good chance for us to get informed. I try to get all of the questions here, so you guys, if there's any questions that you have, pass it over to me. We get it out there, and then hopefully, you bring that information wherever you got to go. And just the information brings knowledge. Knowledge brings power. I mean, in our position, we need that power. Power comes with that sense of authority. So the more information we get, the better we are at doing what we have to do. And guys, as always, guys, thank you for joining in on the discussion. It was your questions that were able to provide us with the answer. So basically, we wouldn't even know to answer anything unless you guys gave us these great questions. That's what I'm trying to say. So
sure.
it's you giving us the information that makes this dialogue so great. So as much as you guys want to thank us, I think we also have to thank you because you're the one that kept the conversation constructive. So as always, guys, the show is Tier Talk. If you haven't, stay safe. Love you guys. Please subscribe, share, interact, engage, and just have fun and enjoy your Labor Day weekend. That's the key. All right, guys, stay safe. Give me a second because I stopped.